Sign from God. Biggest tragedy just happened in Jerusalem. The whole world is scared.
Seem to form into orb-like shapes, moving slowly, almost like spacecraft. Something truly horrifying happened in Brazil this year.
About to be engulfed.
Holy it's going right by the office.
Jerusalem has survived war, earthquakes, and centuries of upheaval. But what unfolded recently did not come from conflict or human hands. Fire emerged from ancient ground without explosion or warning. The sky darkened in minutes. Dust, storms, and strange light followed in rapid succession. These were not isolated moments captured out of context. They formed a sequence, each event pressing closer than the last, forcing people to stop, watch, and question what they were witnessing. This video lays out those moments, one by one, without exaggeration and without conclusions. Watch carefully. And if this feels like more than coincidence to you, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe as we continue tracking what may still be unfolding. It began without sound, without sirens, without the familiar chain of causes people rely on to make sense of disaster, as if the land itself had decided to speak in a language older than memory, deeper than fear. In an area of ancient stone, long believed to be inert and unchanging, fire revealed itself not as an explosion or a violent rupture, but as something far more unsettling, a sustained presence, a living flame rising steadily from beneath the ground, glowing with a depth that suggested it did not belong to the surface world at all. There was no molten river, no volcanic roar, no shockwave to signal its arrival, only a hole in the earth breathing fire, as though it had been waiting for the right moment to open. As darkness fell, the phenomenon transformed from alarming to terrifying, because the fire did not fade or weaken, but instead grew more visually dominant, casting a trembling orange light across walls that had stood for centuries, turning ancient stone into shifting silhouettes that seemed to move when no one moved them. From certain angles, the illuminated rock formed the unmistakable impression of a vast opening, like a mouth carved into the earth itself, wide and patient, glowing from within, as though something unseen were staring back through it. Those who stood nearby reported an oppressive sensation that could not be explained by heat alone, a heaviness in the chest, a tightening of the air, as if the ground beneath their feet was no longer solid but alert. What made the sight truly disturbing was not just what was visible, but what was absent, because there were no prior tremors strong enough to justify it, no known geological shift announced in advance, no human activity capable of triggering such a focused and persistent eruption of flame. The fire did not flicker like something exposed to wind, nor did it behave like an accidental blaze searching for fuel. Instead, maintaining a steady intensity that suggested a source far below, feeding it continuously without interruption. Time passed. Minutes stretched into hours, and the fire remained, unchanged and unmoved, as though the earth had locked itself into a new state and refused to return to silence. Witnesses struggled to describe what they felt, because fear alone was too small a word for it, and curiosity did nothing to dull the instinctive urge to step back, to create distance between themselves and the opening, even as they found it impossible to look away. Many spoke of a deep unease that settled in their bones, a sense that the ground beneath them was no longer passive terrain, but an active force, no longer sleeping, no longer neutral. Ancient words resurfaced in conversation and memory, verses about the earth breaking apart and shaking violently, not as poetry or metaphor, but as something disturbingly literal unfolding in real time. By the time people began to leave the area, glancing back repeatedly, as though expecting the fire to move or follow. One conclusion had already taken hold among them, unspoken yet shared, because this did not feel like a contained incident or a singular anomaly. It felt like an opening act, a signal rather than a conclusion, the first visible fracture in a sequence that had only just begun to reveal itself. It arrived with a speed that felt unnatural, not rolling in gradually like ordinary weather, but surging forward as if released from restraint, a towering mass of airborne earth pouring into the city from the eastern horizon and swallowing distance in seconds. Streets that had been visible moments earlier dissolved into a moving haze. Buildings faded into vague silhouettes, and familiar landmarks lost their shape as the air itself thickened, turning sight into guesswork and space into something unstable. People who looked up expecting sky found only a descending veil, and before anyone could react, Jerusalem began to disappear, not behind walls or debris, but behind suspended ground that erased depth, direction, and certainty. As the dust pressed deeper into the city, daylight lost its clarity and shifted into something sickly and distorted, first dulling into a washed-out yellow and then sinking into a heavy orange gloom that made the sun feel distant and artificial, as though it were shining through layers of stained glass rather than open air. Shadows blurred and stretched unnaturally. Time seemed to slow, and the city took on the appearance of a place being buried while still standing. The soundscape changed as well, because the storm did not simply roar overhead, but flattened noise itself, muting voices and dulling impact, while the wind screamed close to the ground in a constant, abrasive rush that felt less like weather and more like pressure. Dust forced its way into everything, seeping through cracks, vents, and sealed windows, coating interiors that had been closed moments before, and invading spaces that were never meant to be touched by the outside world. Vehicles stalled as air filters clogged and visibility vanished. Homes filled with fine particles that clung to skin and lungs, and ancient stone structures absorbed the grit as though the city's own history were being sandblasted in real time. People stumbled through streets they thought they knew, unable to tell where one block ended and another began, disoriented not by destruction, but by the sudden absence of all the visual cues that had once anchored them. What made the experience especially terrifying was the absence of impact, because nothing exploded, nothing collapsed outright, and no single moment marked the beginning or end of the event, leaving residents trapped inside a slow suffocation of familiarity. Jerusalem was not being attacked or shattered, but quietly stripped of recognition. Its contours softened and erased until it felt like a different place entirely, one where direction had no meaning, and the outside world had become hostile simply by existing. Many described a sensation of being sealed inside a moving cloud, cut off from the sky and from each other, as if the city had been wrapped and hidden rather than struck. Ancient words echoed in the minds of those who endured it, not as distant scripture, but as an uncomfortable parallel, unfolding overhead, the notion of the sun being covered, no longer symbolic, but visibly enacted above rooftops and streets. When the dust finally thinned and the city slowly re-emerged beneath a uniform layer of grit, Jerusalem stood intact, yet altered, quieter and subdued, as though it had passed through something that removed more than it damaged. If you witnessed this moment, or if you believe it was more than extreme weather behaving badly, share your thoughts in the comments. Because whether coincidence or warning, few who stood inside that storm felt it was ordinary. The change did not arrive gradually, nor did it follow the familiar rhythm of a storm forming on the horizon. Within minutes, Jerusalem's sky folded inward on itself as thick black clouds sealed off the light above the city, compressing the air and turning the atmosphere heavy, as though the space itself had decided to close. Daylight dimmed unnaturally fast, and the sky no longer felt distant or open, but low, pressing, and near. Winds surged without warning, screaming through narrow stone streets that were never designed for such force. Ancient walls funneled the pressure into violent corridors, amplifying the sound until it became a continuous howl rather than gusts. A noise that vibrated through stone, glass, and human bodies alike. The wind did not move across the city. It occupied it, forcing itself into every passage and intersection. Rain followed immediately, not as scattered drops or passing sheets, but as a relentless downpour that struck the ground with force. Drainage systems were overwhelmed almost instantly, and roads turned into uncontrolled currents, dragging debris, signage, and fragments of the city into motion. Familiar routes vanished under flowing water, erasing direction and depth. Vehicles stalled where they stood as engines flooded and visibility collapsed. Windows shattered under the combined assault of wind-driven debris and sudden pressure shifts, sending glass inward and outward in sharp, explosive bursts. Streets filled with fragments that caught brief flashes of distorted light before being swept away. Objects meant to stay indoors were suddenly airborne. Furniture, metal panels, and loose masonry tore free and crossed intersections without pattern or warning. Danger no longer came from a single direction. It came from everywhere at once. Those trapped inside cars described a sensation not of exposure, but of enclosure, as if the city had sealed them inside a collapsing shell. Sound pressed inward, vision narrowed to streaks of rain and shadow, and orientation dissolved completely. There was no sense of before or after, only the moment itself. There was no time to prepare, no gradual escalation. Normal life did not slow into crisis. It flipped instantly, replacing routine with emergency before the mind could catch up. Streets that moments earlier carried pedestrians and traffic became channels of chaos stripped of familiarity. The storm did not feel like something passing through Jerusalem. It felt like something descending onto it, pinning the city beneath layers of pressure that refused to lift. In that moment, the storm stopped feeling like weather and began to feel like confinement, as if Jerusalem itself had been sealed shut. If you're still watching, tap like. The pattern is escalating. The moment did not announce itself with spectacle or warning, because the tremor arrived quietly, yet unmistakably, spreading beneath Jerusalem as a restrained force that moved through stone, pavement, and ancient foundations. Subtle enough to confuse at first, yet strong enough that people across multiple districts felt the same disturbance at nearly the same time. Objects trembled, structures sighed, and movement paused, not because collapse followed, but because something beneath the city had shifted in a way that did not belong to routine or memory. Almost immediately after the ground settled, the sky answered. Blue-white flashes cut across the air above Jerusalem with no build-up and no visible source, appearing sharply and disappearing just as fast, neither branching like lightning nor diffusing like distant glow, but precise, cold, and contained, as though the light itself had been switched on and off beyond human reach. What unsettled witnesses most was not only the suddenness of the flashes, but the silence that accompanied them. Because no thunder followed, no echo rolled through the streets, and no sound marked their arrival or departure. There was no rain, no storm front, no electrical tension in the clouds that could prepare the eye or the mind for what appeared, because moments earlier the sky had been still and unremarkable, offering no hint that it was about to change behavior. Several witnesses described the glow as rising rather than descending, as if the light originated near the horizon and pushed upward into the sky. Instead of breaking downward from above, a detail that lingered long after the flashes themselves vanished. As the light disappeared, the city did not return to normal. An unnatural quiet settled over Jerusalem, not the calm that follows weather, nor the tension that follows destruction, but a silence that felt imposed, heavy, and deliberate, as though sound itself had withdrawn. Conversations stalled, movement slowed, and even traffic seemed hesitant, as if the city collectively sensed that something had occurred without revealing its purpose. No explanations arrived in that moment. No immediate statements reassured the population, and no clear cause was offered to anchor what people had just experienced, leaving attention pulled in two directions at once, upward toward the sky that had flashed without sound, and downward toward the ground that had moved without warning. The absence of clarity did not comfort, but intensified the weight of the moment because nothing had been resolved, concluded, or explained away. Psalm 82:5 declares, "The foundations of the earth are shaken," and for many, standing in Jerusalem that night, the verse no longer felt symbolic or distant, but disturbingly descriptive, as though ancient language had stepped into the present without invitation. The tremor itself caused little visible damage, yet when paired with the silent light above, it carried a significance far beyond its physical scale. From that moment on, many said Jerusalem felt different, not ruined or broken, but altered in a way that resisted explanation, as though something had passed through the city without leaving debris, sound, or instruction. And the most unsettling realization was the sense that whatever stirred beneath the ground and answered in the sky had not finished what it began. If this shift feels significant to you, leave a comment and share how you interpret it, and make sure to subscribe, because what follows grows harder to dismiss. The shift in the sky did not arrive with the slow, predictable rhythm of a known celestial event, because the sun was obscured abruptly, without warning or build-up, as though daylight itself had been cut rather than dimmed, forcing Jerusalem into shadow, before anyone had time to understand what they were seeing. The brightness that defined the city only moments earlier collapsed with unnatural speed, draining color from stone and street alike, until familiar outlines softened and the air took on a muted, oppressive tone that felt less like evening and more like a sudden suspension of time. As the light fell away, thick black smoke began spreading across the skyline, not rising from a single point or drifting gently with the wind, but expanding outward and upward in heavy layers that swallowed distance and depth. Buildings faded into silhouettes, hills vanished behind a darkened veil, and the horizon ceased to exist as a reference point, leaving the city enclosed beneath a ceiling that felt low, dense, and unyielding. This was not the clean, eerie clarity of a known eclipse, where the sky sharpens and shadows sharpen with it, but something heavier, more suffocating, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened. The air carried a weight that pressed inward rather than outward, dulling sound and compressing space, while the smoke filtered what little light remained into a murky glow that made it impossible to judge time or direction. People slowed, then stopped entirely, frozen mid-step in streets and courtyards, staring upward not in wonder, but in confusion, because what unfolded above them did not resemble anything they were prepared to recognize. The absence of warning amplified the shock, because there had been no announcement, no expectation, no gradual transition from normal to extraordinary. Movement across the city faltered as uncertainty spread faster than the smoke itself, with drivers hesitating at intersections, pedestrians clustering without speaking, and entire blocks standing still under a sky that no longer behaved as sky. The darkness did not feel like nightfall, nor did it feel like weather, because it carried an oppressive finality that resisted reassurance, making the city feel momentarily removed from its own timeline. Amos 8-9 declares, "I will make the sun go down at noon." And in that moment, the verse ceased to feel symbolic or distant, because the experience unfolding above Jerusalem mirrored the language with unsettling precision. The sky did not simply darken, it collapsed. And the smoke that followed did not decorate the event, but smothered it, erasing clarity and leaving behind a shared sense that something profound had interrupted the ordinary order of things. What unsettled people most was not fear of immediate danger, but the suspension of understanding, because no explanation arrived to soften the moment, and no authority stepped forward to name what was happening. The city remained standing, intact, and silent beneath a darkened canopy that offered no answers, only presence. And the realization grew that this was not an ending in itself, but another escalation in a sequence that refused to slow. If you had been standing there beneath that sky, what would you have believed was happening? And would you have dismissed it or remembered it as a warning? The appearance did not announce itself with sound, speed, or violence, because the first indication that something had changed came from people simply looking up and realizing that a large, luminous form was already there, suspended above Jerusalem, as though it had always belonged to the sky. It did not descend, and it did not arrive from any visible direction, but instead occupied the space above the city with a stillness that felt deliberate, drawing attention not through motion, but through presence. The object hovered or drifted so slowly that its movement was difficult to measure, lacking the acceleration, rotation, or instability that normally accompanies anything airborne, while the absence of sound only deepened the unease, because nothing mechanical, natural, or familiar moves with such weightless silence. Across its surface, multiple points of light pulsed and shifted, not in chaotic bursts, but in subtle variations of intensity, creating the impression of structure rather than randomness, as though the illumination followed an internal order that could not be accessed from the ground. What disturbed witnesses most was what the object did not do. It did not fall toward the earth, and it did not burn against the air, while it left behind no trail, no smoke, and no distortion that would suggest friction or decay. It simply remained, steady and intact, defying the expectations attached to aircraft, meteors, or atmospheric phenomena. And in doing so, it forced the city below into a collective pause, because there was nothing to react to except the fact of its existence. Phones were raised, recordings began, and footage emerged from multiple angles and neighborhoods because the phenomenon lingered long enough to remove doubt that it had been imagined or misseen. Time stretched in its presence, and what might have been dismissed as a fleeting anomaly instead became a shared observation, witnessed by too many people for comfort, yet understood by none. The longer it remained, the more the silence beneath it deepened, as though the city itself sensed that noise would be inappropriate. When the luminous object finally vanished, it did not retreat dramatically or dissolve in fragments, but simply ceased to be there, leaving behind an empty sky that felt altered by comparison. No immediate explanation followed its disappearance. No official statement arrived to anchor the moment in familiar language, and no reassurance softened the weight of what had just passed overhead, allowing speculation and unease to spread unchecked through conversations, recordings, and quiet reflection. Luke 21:11 warns that there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. And for many watching that night, the verse no longer felt distant or symbolic, because the sky above Jerusalem had offered a sign without instruction, without interpretation, and without permission. The most unsettling realization did not come from fear of what the object was, but from the lingering sense of attention, because its stillness and restraint suggested observation rather than invasion. Long after the light disappeared, the feeling remained that Jerusalem had not merely been seen, but studied, and that whatever hovered above the city had done so with purpose, leaving behind an awareness that the sky was no longer empty, and that what had already unfolded might not yet be complete. If you want to continue following signs like these and understand how they connect, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. What unsettles observers most is not any single event taken on its own, because fire rising from the ground, storms swallowing cities, lights appearing in the sky, and darkness falling at noon can each be isolated, labeled, and debated until their edges feel manageable. But when placed side by side, they refuse to remain separate. The concern grows in the space where these moments overlap, where the earth moves, the air destabilizes, light behaves unnaturally, and the sky itself becomes an active participant rather than a passive backdrop, forming a convergence that resists dismissal through coincidence alone. Jerusalem has witnessed history compress itself before, having endured conquest, exile, destruction, and restoration across centuries that reshaped both stone and belief. Yet this sequence does not echo a familiar pattern from the past, nor does it align neatly with known cycles of disaster or conflict. The city has seen signs before, but rarely have they arrived layered so closely together, moving from beneath the ground to above the sky, as though tracing a deliberate path that refuses to stay confined to one domain of explanation. What makes this convergence more disturbing is the absence of clarity rather than the presence of chaos. Because no single moment erupted into total destruction, and no single sign declared its meaning aloud. Instead, each event arrived restrained, measured, and incomplete on its own, leaving behind questions rather than conclusions, which forced attention forward rather than allowing it to settle backward. The lack of resolution became part of the message, because unresolved sequences do not ask to be forgotten, but remembered. Luke 21:28 states, "When these things begin to happen, look up," and the emphasis rests not on the end itself, but on the beginning, on the moment when patterns first emerge and recognition becomes possible. The instruction is not framed as a command to panic or flee, but as a call to awareness, suggesting that the true danger lies not in fear, but in blindness, not in upheaval, but in indifference. This is why the sequence matters more than the spectacle, because spectacle fades, while patterns persist. Earth, air, light, and sky, converging within a narrow span of time, does not demand an immediate verdict, but it does demand attention, especially in a city where symbols carry weight beyond geography, and where history has repeatedly shown that moments of convergence rarely arrive without consequence. The most unsettling realization is that nothing in this sequence has declared itself finished, because each sign feels less like an ending and more like a marker along a path that continues forward, leaving the city and those watching suspended between explanation and expectation. Jerusalem stands intact, yet altered, familiar, yet unsettled, as though it has crossed an unseen threshold without knowing what waits beyond it. This is not a conclusion, and it is not easily dismissed as coincidence, because coincidences scatter, while this sequence aligns. Whether it is interpreted as warning, transition, or something not yet named, the convergence itself remains, pressing the question not of what has already happened, but of what recognition requires next. Leave a like if this sequence made you stop and think. Share your perspective in the comments, whether you see coincidence or warning, and subscribe to the channel to continue following what may still be unfolding. Thank you for watching and staying attentive.